You all see that?
Yes.
I asked if you would read, in preparation for this week's class, Genesis chapter 13. It's a nice, convenient breakup of scripture, a nice, convenient chapter that really only tells one story with some important points. I've entitled this week's lesson, Getting Back on Track. That might bring your mind into last week's lesson, where we considered Abram's and Lot's and Sarah's and all of their people, livestock included, everything, that foray into Egypt, where they left Canaan on account of a famine. And so they went into Egypt, and of course there was Abram's deceit and subterfuge and making up the story about his wife being really his sister, and then the Pharaoh bringing her into his harem. This is the story that immediately follows that, and they find themselves back in Canaan. Before we dive into the text, I'd like to share a quote that I ran across during this week's preparation that hits on a discussion point made last week. As I said, we were pondering over Abram's actions when he went to Egypt, and one of you suggested a more charitable reading of Abram's actions. I think it was you, Judy, that perhaps he was trying to keep the promises of God alive by way of his self-preservation. And it would just so happen that this week I found the following quote in Victor P. Hamilton's book, Handbook on the Pentateuch, which basically makes this very point, and I'm going to quote it. Perhaps Abraham's own question is, will God's promises survive? If there is no Abraham, there can be no subsequent great nation. If that is his thinking at this point, and those the explanation for his attempted ruse, then Abraham becomes the standard bearer for many other believers who felt that God needed a little assistance in extricating himself from a potentially damaging and embarrassing situation. I think we can all relate to that quote in one way or another, and perhaps to Abram's story, where we try to get ourselves out of a bind because we were impatient to see how things would transpire if we left things to providence. This quote is a good segue into this week's lesson. Last week, we considered Abram's lack of faithfulness and even noted that reference to God is virtually absent in Genesis 12, verses 10 through 20. And there is no dialogue between Abram and God. In chapter 13, Abram seems to place his life back on track, living a life of faith and reliance on God. Genesis 13, verse 1 reads, So Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him, into the Negeb. I highlighted Lot with him, made it bold, because Lot will be featured in the next few chapters, and in a big way. What's more, he will nearly always bring trouble into Abram's life. Hamilton writes, at no point does Lot emerge as a worthy and credible person. More often than not, he is an albatross around Abraham's neck. And this begs the question, why is Lot even in the picture in the first place? Why did Abram bring his nephew on this journey when his instructions in relation to his family were very clear? You may recall Genesis chapter 12, verse 1 reads, Now the Lord said to Abram, Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. Lot was both Abram's kindred and from his father's house. So you would think that he would have met the criteria for being left behind. Rickett writes, It would appear that Abraham may not have been totally obedient to God's call to go from country, kin, and his father's household, precisely because he took Lot, a member of his father's household, with him. Verse 2. Now Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver and in gold. He journeyed on by stages from the Negeb as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at the first. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. So for the first time since early in Genesis chapter 12, Abram consults Yahweh. He had not sought guidance before he sojourned to Egypt to save his life, or before he conspired to trick the Egyptians at the expense of his wife. Now Abram puts himself back into right relation to God, and at the very location he had previously communed with God. And I would also want to highlight that he is precisely in a sense, where he began. Not the very beginning of his journey when he left his homeland, but where he had first arrived when he'd been called from that homeland and where he had first built an altar. So he's kind of come around full circle. Sometimes we need to wash up back on the shore from which we set sail to gain in wisdom. Sometimes finding ourselves back where we began, in spite of our best efforts, teaches us the lessons we need to learn. In this case, Abram discovered by way of his time in Egypt that he could not attain the promises of God without reliance on the guidance of God. Now Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them living together. For their possessions were so great that they could not live together, and there was strife between the herders of Abram's livestock and the herders of Lot's livestock. At that time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites lived in the land. Friendline writes in the New Interpreter's Bible Commentary, historically, quarreling among nomads over pastures and wells for their cattle was commonplace in that era. You can see other times in scriptures in Genesis chapter 21 and 26 where this is so. And it was common for families to separate. Hence, one ought not to think of either Lot or Abram as especially quarrelsome, as if different temperaments would have enabled them to live together. So Abram is now faced with a new conundrum, one that is similar to the conundrum that he had in Genesis 12, verse 10, when there was famine in the land and he found that the promised land could not produce or was not suitable for his living. And only this time, the tension is brought on by the fact that he brought Lot in the first place. This is a conundrum that could have been avoided if he had completely cut ties with his roots at the onset of his journey, leaving his kin and his father's house behind. This tension was inevitable, as land can only sustain so much life, so what to do? The problem of scarcity in the land is further exacerbated by the presence of Canaanites and Perizzites. The Abram we met in Egypt in the last chapter would surely have taken matters into his own hands. So what does he do now? Verse 8. Then Abram said to Lot, "Let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herders and my herders, for we are kindred. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go right, or if you take the right hand, then I will go left." First, note that Abram takes the role of peacemaker. He could pull rank here. He is the patriarch in the situation, and he could simply tell his nephew which land to take. But this would no doubt have led to further tension down the road. Second, note that Abram does not try to solve the problem by way of subterfuge or deception. Apparently, the lessons learned in Egypt have stuck for the time being. He will make more mistakes down the road, but as far as it relates to this story, the lesson seems to have stuck. He decides to allow Lot, a force outside of himself, to determine his fate. For Abram, Lot's choice is the proverbial flip of the coin. There seems to be a 50% chance things will go well for Abram and vice versa. Which leads to the question, what if Lot should make a choice that compromises the promises of God? Hamilton writes, "But what if Lot chooses the land that God is going to give to Abraham? Maybe Abraham needs to be more self-assertive, more insistent on his rights. No matter however delicate can be left, no matter however delicate can be left in God's hands. No move by Lot can thwart the promise of God. Unfortunately, Abraham had not lived by that philosophy while he was in Egypt." So, Lot in response, verse 10, Lot looked about him and saw the plain of the Jordan was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt in the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord had destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot made what seemed like a no-brainer kind of decision. Seriously, consider what you would do. If I presented my children a choice between a slice of cake and a piece of bread, you could certainly guess what they choose. The land is compared to the Garden of Eden and to Egypt, which, as we discussed last week, was the most fertile place in the known world, the place of plenty that they had just come from. So Lot makes a choice that you or I would likely have made. Abram, on the other hand, is venturing out in trust and reliance on God. He is taking another one of those leaps of faith, leaps that have been absent whilst he sojourned into Egypt. Neither Abram nor Lot could have known what would transpire in the plain of Jordan in the years to come. The original readers of this story would know firsthand what is foreshadowed in this passage, that the plain of Jordan would become a land of salt, unlivable. And I, in fact, have been there, and it's very arid, and the only place where there is lush growth is around the Jordan River and around the banks of that river. And then a few miles out, it's very desolate. Not much can grow there. So verse 11. So Lot chose for himself all the plain of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the plain that moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now the people of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. There's a bit of foreshadowing there. The references to Eden and to journeying eastward are a nod to a theme throughout the Torah. It's a theme that basically says humanity can never return to an idyllic mythic past, a past that probably never was. Feinlein writes, there can be no going back to Eden, but even more, verse 13 makes it clear that Sodom is no Eden. Lot does not perceive accurately the reality of things. His seeing provides too limited a perspective. Regarding Egypt, the links to Exodus point the way. The issue focuses on Egypt as a garden from which Lot has recently returned. In view of Israel's wandering in the wilderness, begging to return to Egyptian flesh pots, Egypt represents a desire for a pre-redemption state of affairs. That little line about Egyptian flesh pots is a reference to where in the book of Exodus, the people are grumbling and they're upset. And they want to actually return back to where they had been enslaved. And the reason that they give is the fact that they were eating these huge pots of meat. That's sort of the way that our memories of the past can sometimes be seen through rose-colored glasses, when in reality they were enslaved. So it could not have possibly been that good. But Lot goes eastward. Verse 14. The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, raise your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land that you see, I will give you and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. Rise up, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. So Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron. And there he built an altar to the Lord. So Abram finds himself in the exact same place and with the exact same promise he held in Genesis 12, 6-9. He has laid claim to a land that has shown itself to be insufficient for life back in Genesis 12:10. It would seem that nothing has changed except Abram's perspective. He is told by God to carry on as he had done before, journeying up and down the breadth of the land, making altars, worshiping God, and waiting for what comes next. Some takeaways. This story tells of a reset, a reordering of priorities. Abram set out on his journey at the beginning of Genesis chapter 12, but had reverted back to normal patterns of self-reliance and taking matters into his own hands. He had left the land promised him by God for greener pastures and, fortunately, lived to learn the right lessons. Point 2. The inclusion of Lot in Abram's journey is beginning to look like a mistake. In fact, the choice to bring him along seems to indicate that Abram was not quite willing to leave his kindred and father's house and journey out in faith. It could be that his bringing Lot in tow indicates that Abram was not quite ready to leave all behind. Point 3. The reader knows the fate of the region where Lot settles. Lot and Abram, however, cannot see into the future. Lot makes what appears to be a logical, rational, and even wise choice. What is foreshadowed in this chapter and what transpires later just goes to show that we are not in control of our futures. The land Abram gained, as if by default, turned out to be the best place for him to be, even though there seemed to be little about the land to commend itself. We ought to, like Abram, trust in God even when the landscape around us does not look promising. Rickett writes, theologically speaking, then, one may understand Lot's choice to dwell in the Jordan Valley, not solely in terms of geographical location, but in relational demarcation. Though the Jordan Valley looks like the garden of the Lord, God is not actually there. He occupies a different space. Final takeaways. We each in turn find ourselves stalled out, spinning our wheels, inhabiting the same old spaces, marveling at the lush gardens that elude us, the greener grass on the other side of whatever fence. We, like Lot, make choices that seem best suited for the moment. This is not wrong. But remember, we are not ultimately masters of our own fates. But God is faithful to keep us and lead us even as we journey forward with great uncertainty. The Abram we meet in Genesis 13 has begun to learn and relearn this lesson. This will not be the last time he finds himself lacking in faith and trust in God, but for now he is back on track. One of Abram's impediments was his inability to leave all behind. His inclusion of Lot may indeed have been just one of his numerous attempts to help God out in fulfilling the promise, which is another breach of trust. Whatever the case, because Lot accompanied Abram on his journey to the land God would provide, the land was rendered unlivable yet again. In Abram and Lot's parting of the ways, we see Abram cutting ties with his past and what still rooted him to what he was meant to leave behind. We too should consider, what about our former selves, our past lives, do we need to leave behind so that we can fully lean into the places God wants to take us? What persons or memories of persons continue to haunt our present? What burdens of shame or guilt do we continually bear for past actions? What stories from our past, stories that reveal our inadequacies and deficits, still play on in our heads, thus barring us from the joys of God's redemptive work in us? Quick view. Have any of you ever found yourself in a position where you felt like life came around full circle and you seemed to be holding an empty sack except the lessons learned?
No, I'm blessed. It seems wherever we've gone, we're blessed.
Could you repeat that question?
Have you ever found yourself similar to where Abram finds himself at the beginning of this chapter, and then at the end even, in the same place that he had been before he had made this big journey into Egypt to benefit himself, perhaps with an empty sack, but with lessons learned? I have a specific story I can tell, but I would like to know if anyone else could relate to that story, this story on that level.
Well, I don't know.
So when I came to Northwood, I was riding this wave. I've told people before, it was the second time in my life where I felt a providential pull in a direction. It was like a current that I didn't want to resist. And I still, as I reflect on that experience, find it one of the most important moments of my life, as I felt I had such clear direction. And I still believe that was the Spirit of God leading me. And then over the course of the first year, I tried to make everything happen all at once, and in a way that I now look back on and see as forced. A lot of my own ideas, which may have been not necessarily wrong ideas, but ideas that I tried to shoehorn into a context that wasn't either the right place for those ideas, or certain things just outside of my control didn't transpire. A partnership with a friend. You may remember the group we were partnering with to start a new sort of thing going on, and it just sort of all fell apart quickly, like in a month's time. I was planning, focused with a date, then it was gone. And I remember finding myself marking my first year here, feeling like I had been washed up on the shore of Northwood, pulled here on purpose, and then in the same place with very little, despite my efforts around the landscape having changed. And a wise mentor of mine told me that the best thing to do is to walk as if on thin ice. Notice you're not in a dangerous way, but in a sense that you're paying attention to your surroundings. You're not trying to move mountains all at once. You're taking in where you are and responding as the immediate situations call us to respond. And I was reminded of Abram's back in the land, just sort of going back and forth in the land, setting up altars, doing what he felt like he was supposed to do in the moment, and waiting on the next thing. And that's how I connect with this story. And there are a few other stories in my life where similar things happened, usually related to my vocation and job opportunities and things like that. Or, if you've ever pursued a job and really believed that it was the exact place that you should be going, the new promised land, and you spend all of your efforts pursuing that goal, and despite your best efforts, you get the call back, and you're back in the same space, in the same vocational roles that you were in before. Can also feel that way, I think.
I think that for me, I through my life have, this is embarrassing, but I've always thought I had pretty good ideas, and sometimes I do, but I have this assumption that, gee, everybody thinks I have good ideas too, and I don't always follow through on communicating to find out if everybody is on board. You know, like if I'm in a group and say I'm responsible for the direction of that particular group, or I'm one of a member and we're supposed to accomplish something. So then, you know, things may scatter to the winds because I didn't follow through on great communication. So, you know, I often find myself learning that same lesson kind of over and over again. And I don't know if I think that maybe I start learning the lesson, but I kind of keep coming around, I think, just because of my personality and my communication style. But I do try, you know, not to fall into that trap. It may seem small and petty, but it has affected, you know, relationships and jobs and, you know, projects within jobs and things like that. So it is a consequential thing. And I don't know if it's the same as that, but it's also part of, you know, humility and trying to remain humble and asking God and letting God in places, and, you know, remembering, you know, what's my real place, you know, it's not just me and my great idea, but, you know, what's the larger scheme of things. So it's a thing.
As I think about how this story relates to congregational life, and this has been true at every church that I have been a part of in a meaningful way, my childhood churches growing up, the churches that I participated in through college, it seemed like there's always this great anxiety around the future. And so churches come up with plans. Some of them are great plans. There's nothing wrong with this process of trying to find out what's next and plan. But what churches often learn through this process is they can put together the plan, the new vision, and even have the bullet points as to its execution, and find themselves after this foray into this plan. And we won't go so far as to say it's a foray into Egypt. It isn't quite that bad, although sometimes churches can go in directions that are just not wise. But you go on along this journey and you come back and you're looking at the landscape, and you're back in Canaan. The land that you had decided before you left was insufficient to the sort of life you wanted. And you could either learn to double down and to create even a more anxiety-inducing plan or process and create more pressure, up the ante, or you could look at the landscape, worship God, assess what you have, and trust that God has not called you, this community together, whether it's Northwood or any other church, together for them to fail. That there is a meaning and a purpose to the congregants congregating. And you find out what that is going forward. And it might not always fit the metric of success that corporate America puts onto churches, or it might, but I think that there's a great metaphor in this story for church life and maybe communal life broadly speaking.
So are you saying that Abram should have behaved differently when he came back from
No.
Egypt?
No, I'm saying that his decision to notice when Lot asks when instead of coming up with a plan to get the land that looks the best, he throws it into his nephew's decision. He makes it his nephew's decision. He divests of control, and that is an overture of trust, not just for Lot specifically, but more about, okay, God, when I went into Egypt and tried to move things and make things happen, I came back, I got walked back to the border of Canaan. That wasn't the place for me to be. And in this story, Abram's roles, with the exception of building altars to seek God, his role is passive. And this section of the story ends with him really not having the answers, but continuing to wander with God in the wilderness of Canaan. And spoiler alert, most of the Torah is the people of God wandering through the wilderness of Canaan.
I do think if we go to verse 7, and it says, and quarreling rose between Abram's herdsman and the herdsman of Lot. And then Abraham says, let us not have quarreling. And I think perhaps at that point, he doesn't want to argue about it. He just, okay, Lot, you do whatever you want to do. I don't want to fight about it. If we consider those scriptures when we think about the situation. And I do have, first of all, let me tell you, I had to chuckle when I saw the motorcycle with the sheep.
The cattle.
I was looking, I was studying them, and I think, oh, very pastoral. And then I see this motorcycle. I thought, oh. As I recall someplace in my learnings, Abram took his father with him, and it may have been because of the age of his father, and that they stopped at Haran because at that point the father couldn't go any farther or whatever. And also that Lot's father was deceased, and that Abram felt responsibility for him as his child because the father was deceased. And if you think about it, when God's making all these promises, later on in the story, when he's talking to God, he says, but God, right now, I'm going to leave everything to whoever takes care of everything for him. I forget what his name is. He says, that's actually my descendant. That's the closest thing I have to a descendant. And so Lot would have been at that time the closest thing he had to a descendant.
Yeah, it speaks back to kind of where we began this conversation with what's motivating Abram when he is trying to get trying to move along the plan towards the promises, which in Egypt seemed to be his self-preservation, seemed to be the way to get to the promises. But people do speculate if that's why he brought Lot along, knowing he was advanced in years, saying this is maybe my only shot. Lot may be my only shot at a future for my house. None of this speaks. When I said earlier that Lot seemed to only kind of bring trouble, that isn't a critique of his character so much as just a fact of what happens. For example, right here, this is this friction that they have here. And then in the next chapter, you're going to see Abram having to go in with a very specific number of soldiers to recapture Lot, because he had been captured by these like warring kings that all of a sudden drop into the story. And I say very specific number. I'm not sure what that is about, and I'm not sure how much we're going to even talk about it in the future. That's one of the things I need to decide in the next couple of weeks. But if he had left Lot back in Ur, where he had come from, Lot seems to have been set up rather well. It mentions in this text that he had an abundance of livestock and lots of things to be getting on with. And if he had obeyed the command initially to the letter of the law, which was to leave your kin, your father's household, everyone, there were several problems that would present themselves later that he would not have had. So it could be another one of those examples where Abram doesn't quite live up to the challenge of walking in faith and obedience into the unknown, or maybe we're reading too much into it. It's really hard to know.
Well, I think sometimes we might misinterpret what God's trying to tell us. And yeah, how many times do you think you've stepped out because you feel God's leading you in a place, and then all of a sudden, as you said, everything falls through? That happens frequently, I think.
One of my formative stories as it relates to faith and blind faith, it was a gift given me by my brother. So we had just come back from like kids Bible school, like vacation Bible school, but it was at like a camp, and so we're kind of the place where you stay the night. And actually it was family camp. I want to be more specific. The whole families go, and many times they stay the night. And a big revival sort of tabernacle, think Gaither wannabe bands, gospel quartets and the whole thing, and a week's worth of preaching, 2 sermons a day. I mean, we went to the kids' church, and we saw they did the trust fall exercise, to where somebody will fall into the arms, and the idea was, obviously have faith that I will catch you, and just like that, God will catch you if you should decide to trust in God. And we get home, and my brother, with what I can only describe as a sort of a manic glee on his face, he was about 8 years old, pointed his finger to the ceiling and said, "I have faith," and fell back like a tree onto the back of his head.
With no one behind him.
The moral I get from that story, and I think he was just being silly. It's hard to know what was going on in his head. But what's left of it after that, I'm just kidding. He's a super bright guy. But not every challenging leap into the unknown is called for, is necessary, or even being asked of you. And so that's where the process of discernment, which is always ambiguous and seldom as clear as what I described earlier as my call into Northwood. At least it was clear to me. Seldom as clear as that. As I said, only twice in my life have I experienced it. The rest is this work that we do as a community, which is why church is so important, that we talk about who we will be together. Because the more minds and hearts and wise heads you have trying to decide what the future of a community should be like, the better chance you have of taking the right steps out in faith and not falling on your head.
I'm curious about collective shame and even maybe collective guilt, and the sort of, this may not be this. I don't know where this is going to go. So I'm just going to put it out there. there is a real divide that seems to be getting bigger about, say, Black Lives Matter. And, there's a real tendency, I think, for some people at least, to say, okay, they don't have a right to do what they're doing. They're causing anarchy. They're rioting and destroying. They're destroying the fabric of our nation. And that is a real problem, but I think, because I don't think it's true. And I think that other people, white people, identify with that because of their own shame and guilt. And they also, they have real trouble coming to grips with their own part in a racist history that built a nation on slavery and became a profitable nation because of slavery, and has mistreated Black people by denying them the same freedoms of whatever, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness for all these years. And I think that the kind of unconscious forces in us, I mean, even in my family, I look at my family and I think, well, they're all good people. They were abolitionists. They were Lincoln Republicans. They couldn't be racist. And yet they were silent, the ones I grew up with and knew, they were silent on issues of redlining in my community. They were silent when the curriculum in my high school didn't teach about Jim Crow or the lynchings that were going on contemporaneously, even when I was growing up. And so, I think we all are complicit in keeping Black people down, and yet I see people that might take advantage of that shame and guilt really driving a wedge between all of us. And I think it is something we need to leave behind, but I don't know how that message gets out. So
we must never weaponize shame. Shame is Brene Brown rightly identifies shame as a tool of the oppressor. And so one thing I have observed is shame being weaponized by anti-racist advocates. And that is not helpful. That's different than guilt, in recognizing our own complicity in systems. And that might lead to our own internalized shame that hopefully moves us to action. But that's a different experiencing shame as a result of awareness of to what degree we are compromised by our economic systems, ethically compromised by economic systems. That's different than using shame as a bludgeon. It does not, and I get why. Here's why I don't judge too harshly those that do it on the anti-racist side, unless they seem to be coming at it from a place of true vitriol. People who have internalized their own shame or have been shamed for things as arbitrary as the color of their skin or their poverty or their incarcerations or whatever it is, it becomes intuitive to try to deflect the shame onto another. That starts in schoolyard politics, with when dealing with bullies. And so I'm not surprised that shame is being weaponized. I'm just pointing out the fact that as a strategy, it just divides the wedge deeper. And shaming people for weaponizing shame exacerbates it. So what I've tried to do, and it has to operate at several levels. You have to be aware of the systems that keep white supremacy entrenched without using actually racially coded language. So that's an educational goal. How the prison system works, and why interactions with police, like we saw in LA this week, begin because a person is riding their bicycle, has a vehicle infraction relating to them riding a bicycle. And whatever happened after that, is still trying to be determined. But why is somebody being stopped for riding a bicycle and then chased? It's just, well, there's reasons for why the laws are written the way that they are as it relates to easy excuses to arrest poor people in poverty drawn along color lines. So there's understanding that. And that's an endeavor of education.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's the communal level. And this is where I'm in 2 book groups on white fragility. One is amongst clergy. And then another is with friends from Carmel and Fishers, who are the very face of white flight into the suburbs. And they did not even know that until this year. And they are, I'm so proud of them for being willing to have these hard conversations, recognize the generational transfer of wealth from their rich parents for what
That's
it
right.
is.
That's right.
And then also do the internalized work. There are a few in the group who are resisting hard. I think it has to do with this question of what to do with the shame. You can either turn it out and blame others and scapegoat others, or you can process it and realize that to what degree it's helpful towards your transformation, allow it to be, and to what degree it's not. You have to ask God to help you through it and know that you can only help what you can help.
I think for myself, I take the gifts of my ancestors. I'm not divorcing myself from them. They're wonderful. They're good. I have decided they were and are good people. And no matter what their imperfections, it's like the founding fathers. They were imperfect, but they gave us a way forward so that we can change whatever it is we need to change about our country. But, I think that this group in Carmel, that's a hopeful thing. That's wonderful. That's great.
All of them are in Carmel and Westfield, except for us.
Yeah.
And they are in very nice homes and nice communities. Their parents were doctors, ran businesses, lawyers. They come from different, like my parents, it's kind of half and half. From my dad's side, it's a line of preachers that were at least able to own homes. So there's that kind of equity, but not like what I'm describing in my friends I'm describing. Then my mom, her father was a World War II vet who benefited by the subsidies provided for vets who came home to buy an affordable house, which was not made available to most Black veterans because it was written into the legislation that if you were a farm laborer or worked in households, like as a cleaner, like a launderer and stuff, very specific roles that predominantly Black people did, they could not have access to those loans. So after World War II, my grandfather got a home in that way. And then I just had a conversation today as I was getting back from my run before this. Neighbor across the street, moving truck, moving out. And he said to me, I said, "Are you moving out?" And he said, "Yeah, I'm moving out." I said, where are you heading? He goes, "Don't know yet." I said, "I'm so sorry to hear that. I hope you land on your feet." And he says, "Does your landlord have any open properties that you're aware of?" And the unspoken reality that I did not correct him on is I own my home. Because the bank looked at my situation and said that I was fit for it. When the home ownership in houses of color, and this is a Black man I'm talking about. So am I the face of gentrification in the neighborhood that he's leaving because he can't make rent? I don't know what to do with that. In that moment, I was aware of the economic structures at play as it relates to housing and home equity. I didn't feel any personal shame, but it did keep at the forefront of my mind the necessity of changing the system so that affordable housing and home ownership is more available, and not in the way that it was before the economic crash, where poor people, white and brown skin and black skin, everybody were given access to just really bad loans when they shouldn't have been able to. And at that time, home ownership amongst black people was as high as it had been in our country, and it was immediately pulled out from underneath them. So it's a long rambling talk to say what to do with shame, guilt, complicity. All of these things are all related to that little story that happened an hour and a half ago in front of my house. So what I try to do is educate and advocate, and Reverend William Barber II is always quick to point out there are more poor white people than black people,
Mm-hmm.
and keeping us pit against each other in this way is actually part of the strategy to keep this economic system in place, which does disproportionately hurt black and brown people, but also hurts more in terms of just raw numbers, more white people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's been excellent work done on that, on why it was a book by Carol Anderson called White Trash, and it's about poor whiteness and how the psychology of this concept called white trash, and how poor people are kept segregated along color lines because in moments in history where those have been transcended, real change happened. Because I could keep going on and on about this. It's a subject I'm very interested in, but it used to be that before even the United States was an idea, that there was basically, if you were a black slave or a white slave, your situation here in the United States was very similar. Mm-hmm. And there were usually off-ramps, like 10 years out, called it indentured servitude. Spoiler alert, most people died before they got to that 10-year window. But there was a rebellion in Virginia. It's called Bacon's Rebellion. A man named John Bacon, who had no interest in liberating slaves, but wanted to have the militia of the Commonwealth of Virginia push westward expansion and drive more indigenous peoples off the land so that he, as a plantation owner, could have more room for crops. And England was not keen on this. It was still colonies at the time. It was not keen on this because they were so taxed in terms of resources that more westward expansion through military push they felt would break the bank. So they said no. So what John Bacon did was he called together the poor white people and the poor black people and fomented a rebellion and burnt plantations through the land, freaked out the Commonwealth of Virginia. They mobilized the militia, and then they put down the rebellion. And they decided we cannot let the poor black people and the poor white people to work like this. So they put into law the first black codes, which was they can't congregate in common houses because that way they wouldn't be able to learn the same languages. They made the slavery for black people lifelong and kept the indentured class for the whites, and put just enough of an advantage for the poor whites that they could resent the poor black people. At least I'm not them. And that was how it began as it relates to chattel slavery in the United States, to keep us divided. Mm. And it's insidious. And all this to say, when white people realize that the liberation and full inclusion in the body politic and in the economic system of all persons benefits us as well. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a Christian idea that the whole body must, in the church at least, must care for every other member and be concerned with. Till we learn that this is a fight for our own, my children's, and everyone's well-being in the big picture. I don't know how to condense that and get that out to people. I don't know.
I had an experience once that somebody criticized somebody. And in my way of thinking, I thought, these people have only done what they have been taught to do. They're living the way they've been taught to live. And I think that's still true today. Only now, with communication the way it is, we have the opportunity to start sharing ideas and to make things that are unjust come to the surface so that we can try to correct them as best we can. But we all of us are only what we've experienced in our lives. And so we have to be open to the things around us and be open to what's unjust and try to do what we can to help.
Well said.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if we're going to do better than that.
Thank you.
Maybe a good note to end on.
Okay.
We have that meeting tonight with my friends from Carmel and Westfield. It has been so encouraging.
Great.
How did that start?
Kelly said that her friends were noticing that we were involved in these in these movements and discussions in a more visible way, and she was the only friend they had that was really talking about these issues. And so they said, what should we do? They were just like literally show us the first step, and we're like, well, we've got some books that we think are very accessible. If you'd read them with us. We did not want to lead the group. It was their initiative. They already had a small group, Bible, like a Bible study sometimes a devotional group. It depended on the season. They'd pick a different thing.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what they decided to do.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, there's been some people who are really struggling. I'm proud of them for sticking with it and naming their discomfort, because that in and of itself is a testament to a community's ability to have a very difficult discussion. But yeah, it's a Zoom call. We do it every 2 weeks, and then throughout the weeks that we're not on, we send video messages of our thoughts about the most recent chapters we've read.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's awesome. I really do, because I think, what you said at the beginning of that is that they didn't even realize that that's what they were, part of this white flight.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw that happen in teaching at a school where I was in a middle school. So there was a gifted and talented program at that middle school. And what I found over the years that I was working there is more and more and more of those parents of the gifted and talented children were asking for recommendations to get their children into Park Tudor or Cathedral or other schools. And they weren't doing it as a white flight. They were doing it because, in their minds anyway, their children didn't have several years for problems to be figured out. Mm-hmm. They saw that if I don't get my child out of this situation, a lot of it came from bad press in the school system, that this school system was getting way more bad press in proportion to other school systems. And so they were seeing this. They were seeing bad things happening at the high school, which were happening at all high schools. It was just getting more press at this particular high school. And they were seeing that, we can't wait a year or two for this to be figured out, because our kids only have 1 year in this grade and 1 year in this grade and 1 year in this grade. So I can see how people are not even really thinking that through that way, how they find themselves in the position that the people in your group find themselves in. They didn't realize that what they were doing was exacerbating another problem.
Bye, Nancy. Thanks for coming. To use a Flint in Flint right now, there's the water crisis has not been solved. They still do not have clean drinking water. The bottled water filters, it's a mess. Who knows how many children's lives will be completely changed because of the lead poisoning that will alter their ability to think and to be healthy. So there's that happening. People ask the next question, well, why don't you go to put yourself in a more advantageous position? Like, why don't you leave? They can't afford to leave.
Yeah.
Some people who could afford to leave, I'm sure, have left. As it relates to the discussion you were just having, the schools, there are some people with generational wealth mostly, who are able to replant their lives in another
Mhm.
place.
Mhm.
And then the ones that can't stay, and then they hack it out in that journey of how do you work it out over the couple of years that theoretically the people who left didn't have,
Mhm.
are left with it, and with fewer resources, because for some reason schools are funded by property taxes, and in places where property taxes are higher, they get more funding, and then that just keeps the problem more deeply entrenched. So
We had a school that opened up within that school system that was, they didn't want to say it was a select school, but that's what it was turning out to be, because there was an application process to get in, and then it was supposed to be a lottery. It was supposed to be a drawing then of all the applications. But what we were seeing was that the kids that probably needed that opportunity the most had the parents that didn't have the wherewithal to know what to do with the application.
mhm,
They just didn't. So
mhm.
the applications weren't being filed, and the students who really would have benefited a lot from that opportunity just didn't get it.
Yeah.
This is the fact that these conversations are happening in earnest all over the globe, really, but especially here and now, is very encouraging. The same, and we do need to hop off. We've been on for an hour. But the same people who are having the conversation with me in this group that meets tonight, 4 or 5 years ago, we'd be at like a barbecue or a party where you're supposed to be sort of polite and keep it light, and I would reflexively at that time not really read the room and push the conversation in these directions. And I realized over time that it was not a welcome conversation in those circles, that they weren't buying the premise, and they were feeling personally, put on the spot and attacked. And I probably wasn't being as tactful as I should have been. But now they've come back, and this is what they're wanting to have. They've instigated the conversation. And that change is, to me, beyond what I had hoped. And I'm so encouraged. So, well, thank you for this discussion. Sorry we won't see you for the next 2 weeks, Sue, in Bible studies, but I'll see you Sunday.
Yeah.
And I'll see you all, I hope, Sunday. And Connie, I'll see you tomorrow. And
And
you all
thanks
take care.
again, Sue, for the pre-bagging
Yes,
on
okay.
Friday. So appreciate it.
I'm going to go ahead and end this
Thank
now.
you. Okay. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.